What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to part 2 of the Apocalyptic Zombie Killing Bus. In this video, we're going to go over some of the UVs and then head over to Substance Painter to do some texturing. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So to start things off, we're going to select all of the objects in our scene and we can delete the history, just to remove any unwanted items. And then we can go through and delete anything out of our outliner that we don't need, like any empty folders. Alright, so we're going to start off with the first item in our outliner, which is the front window. So we're going to start off with just renaming that first, and then we can isolate it and zoom in. Now just to make sure it's all nice and smooth, I'm going to go up to mesh and smooth it out once. And then I can open up my UV editor, select that UV shell and unfold it. I can do that by pressing Ctrl U, and then I can just rotate it by eye to make sure that that shell is nice and straight. Alright, so we're going to select the next item in our outliner, which is the roof. Now we're just seeing this in a preview smooth, so we're going to press 1 on our keyboard so we can undo that, and then we want to apply a smoothing effect to it. So we can go up to mesh and go down to smooth, and then we can increase our divisions up to 2. Now this is a great spot in this UVing process where you don't necessarily have to increase it to 2 depending on how you're going to use your model. In this case, I'm just going to be using it for a high poly model just for this video, but if you wanted to have a lower poly model and maybe have a high and low poly model workflow, you can simply just increase those divisions to 1 and then just UV the object. So just like we're going to do in this video, you can go up to your 3D cut and sew UV tool and apply cuts wherever you want on the model. And then once that object is all UV'd and it's all laid out properly in your UV editor, you can just basically duplicate that same object over and increase those divisions even higher. So you have really nice smooth edges, and then you have a higher poly model that has the same UVs. And then when we jump into Substance Painter, you can easily load in that higher poly model as your high poly model and use this low poly one as your low poly model. So there's many ways you can go about UVing your object depending on how it's going to be used, but that's obviously more work. So in this case, we're just going to create a higher poly model and we can just quickly go through these UVs. Now obviously there are other ways you could use a high and low poly model workflow. We're not going to go through that in this video, but I just wanted to quickly make a note of that. So just like we did in our first object, we are going to make sure those UV shells are nice and straight in our UV editor, and then we can move on to the next object in our outliner. So next up is the window frame. Now this is a good example of an object that I've only created one side, so we'll have to duplicate this over and attach it. So I'm going to zoom in and start just refining the object. Now because this whole Apocalypse bus is so large, when I was modeling a lot of these shapes, I was quickly rushing it just so I can fill up all of these areas. And what I like to do is when I come back throughout this UVing process, I like to refine the shapes. Now, as you can see with this window frame, I quickly rushed it, and as you can see, I definitely messed up a little corner and it's not looking correct. So what we'll have to do is just play around with those vertices and make sure this window frame is looking accurate and correct, especially with all the other shapes around it, so it's nice fitting properly on that window, and then we can go ahead and start UVing it. Alright, so now that our window frame is looking much better, we can go ahead and start UVing it. So we're going to press 1 on our keyboard to unpreview the smooth, and we want to apply a smoothing effect to it once again. So we're going to go up to mesh and go down to smooth and increase those divisions up to 2. Now as you can see, there's lots of unnecessary faces on the backside of this object, so we want to delete them. Now I should have done that before I actually smooth the object, but since we already did that, we are simply just going to do a camera-based projection to remove all of the cuts, and we can use our 3D cut and sew UV tool to make some cuts on the backside of this object. Then in my UV editor, I can select that back UV shell and simply just delete it out of my scene. So then all we have to do is with our 3D cut and sew UV tool, just do some nice cuts along those edges. So once I unfold them by pressing Ctrl U and laying them out by pressing Ctrl L in my UV editor, everything is looking nice and unfolded, and I can just rotate those shells to look nice and straight. Alright, so now that we have those UVs done, we just need to create the other side. So I'm going to go up to Edit and go down to Duplicate Special, and I can just duplicate that along the X-axis. Once I duplicated that object over, I realized that I have a nice window frame piece right in the center of this object, so I don't really need to reattach this window. I can actually cheat a little bit and use the same UV space and just basically keep it exactly where it is. So what I'm going to do is just select all those UV shells, shrink them down and move them to the side so we can place them on my UV map later on. So now I can just select both of those window frame pieces, I can group them together, give that group a name, and then I can move on to another object. Alright, so next up is that small middle window frame piece. Now this is pretty straightforward, it's just a small rectangle, so what we're going to do is make sure that that back face and the top and bottom faces are removed and deleted out of the scene, and then simply we can just select those two front edges and give them a small bevel. So next, I just want to make sure I delete history, freeze transformations, and center pivot, and then I can go up to UV and do a camera-based projection just to remove any cuts on the model. And then in my UV editor, I can simply just select that UV shell, Control U to unfold, and then Control L to lay it out. Then I can just rotate this UV shell to make sure it's nice and straight, and since this shell has nice straight lines, I can go to the Unfold tab on the right and go down to Straighten Shell just to make sure everything is nice and straight. So next, I'm just going to select this object, I'm going to add that into my window frame group I created earlier, and then we can move on to the next object in our outliner. So I basically just keep repeating this exact same process for all the other objects in my scene. So with this next one, you'll see I just delete all those back faces since they're unnecessary and adding unnecessary polys. And then I can smooth it out by going mesh smooth and increasing those divisions, and then just duplicating it over to the other side and just attaching it. Now I didn't attach the window frame below just because it's very small, but when it comes to the roof and the larger window frame piece, I decided to attach those UV shells. That way I didn't have any repeating patterns in those textures when we jump into Substance Painter. I find when you're overlaying a lot of those UV shells, you may be saving a lot of space. However, you're gonna see repeating patterns and it's not really gonna look the best in my opinion. So it's important to choose which objects have overlapping UV shells and which ones don't. Obviously, the larger objects I find are better off as their own UV shell, and then the smaller objects like those little bolts and everything can just overlap since you're really not going to see that repeating pattern. So when I get to the roof object, for example, you'll see that I just bridged together those two edges. That way it's one big piece and I'm not going to see any repeating patterns on that large object. So let's go ahead and just continue UVing these objects, and then I'll just skip ahead to when we're organizing some of those shells. Alright, so that's basically how I did all of the UVing. I just keep repeating this exact same process for all the other objects in my scene. Now since there's so many objects, I'm not going to make you watch all of that. Now if you're interested in seeing it, I will be uploading a separate video, the real-time full video, to my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. But for now, we're just going to skip ahead to the end of the UVing process when I'm organizing some of these shells, just so I can go over exactly how I did that. Alright, so here we are, just skipped ahead to when I'm working on my last group, just those rear end objects on my bus. And as you can see, I'm just basically moving those shells off to the side and starting to prioritize which objects I want to take up the larger space. Now you'll see that some of those shells are pink, and that's just because they're basically overlapping each other and they're mirrored to the opposite side, so basically the normals are flipped. Now I could flip those, but they're not going to be taking up the exact same space, so we're just going to cut the corners and basically keep those overlaps since you're not going to be seeing the exact same sides at once. So since I didn't create an interior to this bus, I thought I should quickly add some windows, that way I can fill in that empty space and you're not going to see into nothing. So I quickly add a small plane, and then I can fill in that empty space in my window frames, and I can place them behind all of those protective bars. Now soon enough you'll see when I get to the windows, they're currently all overlapping the same space, and I probably should have just left it like that, but I thought before I jumped into Substance that you were going to see too much repeating patterns on those windows, so what I decided to do was just basically select all of them and Control L to lay them all out so they're not overlapping each other, and then I can just shrink them down and fit them into my UV editor. And then right after the windows, when I get to those front headlights, I thought they were looking too bare. Everything else had armor and the front headlights were just wide open, and I didn't really add too much detail around that area. So what I decided to do was add a small cube, and I could start extruding those faces to make a small little bar that protected that front headlight. I do this a lot when I get to the UVing stage in my model. I find that there's small little details I'd like to add, so I'll quickly add those small objects along the way. Plus, sometimes I just have more room in my UV editor than I thought I would, and I have a lot of empty space. So either I like to just scale those UV shells up, or I like just to add extra objects in my scene just to fill in those empty spaces. So let's just continue moving these shells around, let's organize this last group, and then I'll quickly go over the final model and show you all of the groups. Alright, so that's basically everything. So now I'll just quickly go over the whole model. Alright, so here's a model in its finished form. Now I decided to break this thing up into 5 different groups for the 5 different textures applied. Now how you go about grouping these objects is completely up to you, and how many textures you used is really dependent on how this model is going to be used and where it's going to be used. In this case, it's a really high poly model. I'm not going to be using this in a video game or anything like that. It's just going to be for this video. So I just decided to go with 5 textures. That way I can have a lot of resolution or nice detail in these textures, and I don't need to worry about squishing all these UV shells very small. So what I decided to do was have one group for the main shell and the roof, and basically just keep this nice and simple. That way I could basically enlarge these shells really nice and have some nice detail. Now one thing I did do was prioritize my shells, so as you can see, this one is the top, since it's obviously very large in my scene. And the very bottom or underneath, I believe it's this one. Oh, it's this guy over here. It's very small. You're not going to see it. I could have probably just deleted it out of my scene, to be honest, but I had that extra room, so I just shrunk it down nice and small. And I did that for all of my objects, and all of these purple ones you're seeing here, they're just mirrored to the other side. So everything I do here will just appear here, and it's just going to save me time texturing since you're not going to see both sides at the same time. Now for the second group and second texture is the whole front objects. Now I probably could have just combined this to, let's say, the top objects or something like that, but once again, just wanted to have nice resolution and detail in those textures, so I decided to give these objects their own texture. Now one thing I did do was obviously just combine some of these objects, so duplicate those objects over, so this arm is the same as this arm. They're taking up the exact same place, and I just don't need to texture 2 arms. I can just texture one, and you're not going to see both sides at the same time. Now one thing I did make sure to do was, when it came to some of these bars on the top, they are sharing the same UV space, but not all of them. I decided to select some of them and move them over. That way they're not going to have repeating patterns when you're looking nice and close, and it's just going to look like they're basically all unique. And then also the ones that were sharing the same space, I would just spin them around. That way, once again, you're not going to see a repeating pattern. So the third group and texture was all the top objects. So this was just all the barbed wire, and just decided to keep these as their own texture group. And the fourth was all the side armor and the wheels, as well as all of those armor pieces on the windows. Now, one thing I do want to just quickly mention is, if you wanted to save a lot of polys and you were going to use this in, like, let's say a video game, one thing I would definitely do was just change how I approach these windows. All of this little grid pattern you see here could just be simply put into the material and texture. I could just add a simple plane and then add that see-through effect, and you wouldn't notice a difference. I wanted to make sure I pointed that out just because they're taking up so much for so many polys, especially with these bars, like how rounded they are. You could just simplify that cylinder shape and just not have so many edges, and you can save on a lot of polys. Alright, so the final fifth texture group is just the rear objects. So you probably saw them earlier, just also the windows that I quickly added into my scene, and then just these armor plates. Now once again, one thing I did make sure to do was, I did mirror this object over originally, but I realized I would have repeating patterns on the back end, and I wanted to have some cool graffiti and just bloody hand marks. So I just made sure that these 2 outside shells are actually taking up different places on my UV map. And then, as you'll see, the rears are much smaller, and they're just overlapping since they're not important and you're not going to see them. Now I also wanted to note, if you were creating this model for a client or for a video game studio, you would have to approach this model much differently. You'd have to clean up a lot of this topology. I just really rushed a lot of these UVs. For example, you can see a lot of those red faces. I probably could have flipped some of those and rearranged them to take up some of those empty spaces. I still had lots of empty space I could have prioritized on my UV map, but this model took definitely a lot longer than I originally planned it to, so I just wanted to quickly get through this. So So I just wanted to make a note of that for anybody following these videos for tutorial or educational purposes. Creating these high poly models are definitely a lot of fun, but it's important to know how you're approaching them and how they're going to be used, because something as high and dense as this could not be easily run in a video game or a mobile app. Maybe in Unreal Engine 5 or something, but there are a lot of restrictions when it comes to 3D assets depending on how they're used and how many textures they have. So keep that in mind. An optimized, efficient model is always better than just a really good looking model. So keep that in mind when you're creating these assets and really think about how you're going to use your model. Alright, so that's basically how I did all of my grouping and how I applied my textures. And now we can quickly jump into Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Now this whole video is basically just going to be a time-lapse speed modeling video similar to part 1. However, I am really quickly just going to go over a few small things. Now, when it came to the whole texturing process, I was pretty determined just to get through this pretty quickly. I spent so much time 3D modeling and UVing it, I didn't want to spend hours and hours just texturing this thing. Now, thankfully, Substance Painter is really great when it comes to smart materials and just textures in general, and it makes texturing pretty easy. So we're going to use smart materials to our full advantage here, and I'm going to try to get through this pretty quickly. So when it comes to texturing, what I like to do is basically fill up all of those empty spaces pretty quickly, and then I can always come back to them later on and tweak them and adjust those colors and materials and settings to however I want them to look. So what I'm going to do here is just really quickly go through the Smart Materials folder, just apply whatever Smart Materials I'd like to fill up these empty spaces, basically acting as some sort of foundation, a nice structure for my material. So I basically choose however I want it to look, so a nice metal texture or a nice wood texture, and then I can always tweak those settings and colors afterwards. Now don't get me wrong, creating your own materials is great if you have the time for it. In this case, I wanted to get through this relatively quickly, so we're going to use Substance Painter to our full advantage. So as you'll see here, I'm starting on the very top of my texture set list on my texture 1, which is my main base shape, and I can start just applying some materials. Now when it came to the textures, I really wasn't sure exactly how I wanted it to look. Unfortunately, the model or the reference photo that I was following was not textured, so I really didn't have any sort of guidance on how I wanted it to look, so I had to basically just create it on my own. Now because this is an apocalyptic bus, I did want it to look a little bit weathered and beaten up, so I wanted to use a nice beaten up smart material as a base, and obviously a school bus is yellow, so I thought a yellow school bus would just be fitting. So you'll see throughout this whole texturing process, I just experiment with different materials and textures and throw on different masking effects to add different grunges, and I just experiment a lot along the way because I just wasn't sure exactly how I wanted it to look. And that's also why this video was a lot longer than I was originally planned. Because I didn't really plan it out going into it, I had to experiment a lot more than I originally planned to. That being said, I'm still really happy with how it turned out. I still wish I added a few extra objects like some shovels or some tools and things strapped onto the roof, or some extra guns in those windows. I thought that would definitely be a cool little part to the model that I wish I added. However, like I said, I'm still really happy with how it turned out. So let's just continue filling these empty meshes with materials, and we can start texturing this school bus. Alright, really quickly, I just wanted to comment on this since I was adding some nice texture onto my wheel. I thought I would just jump onto Google and just Google a random off-road tire, and then I can just basically paint it onto the side to have that graphic, the words that go around, and as well as some little tire texture or material. However, the picture that I chose was not the best, so I had to play around with it a lot to make it work, and just what I should have done was just choose a different image on Google to make my life easier. So I just wanted to point that out. If you choose an easier image that fits your tire size, you can just make this whole process a little bit easier for yourself. Alright, so that's basically everything. That is the whole texturing and UVing process that I did to create this apocalyptic zombie killing bus. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to see more weekly 3D content. I'm on a mission to get to 10,000 subscribers and we're so close. So if you'd like to help me get there, hit that subscribe button and it would really help me out. And for everyone else who is already subscribed and for all of my Patreons, thank you so much for the continuous support. It really goes a long way. Don't forget, I will be uploading this video at a real-time pace, including the whole UV mapping process, along with the whole Substance Painter working files. So if you'd like to check that out, it will be uploaded to my Patreon page, and you can find that in the link in the description below. Once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you guys in the next one.